I think it's for leagues and the governing bodies to work with their athletes to find solutions, but our focus is on basketball, and that's what we talk about and how we can get wins.
Hello guys, welcome back. So this is something I've been seeing all over social media since the Minnesota Lynx beat the Indiana Fever. And honestly, I think the conversation has gotten completely out of hand. The standards people are holding Caitlin Clark to right now are absolutely ridiculous. I went back and watched the entire game again from start to finish because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. After watching it a second time, my opinion didn't change at all. Caitlin Clark played a good basketball game. Not an amazing game, not an MVP masterpiece, not one of those nights where she completely takes over from beginning to end. She was simply good, and that's perfectly okay. Sometimes a good game is just a good game. If someone had never watched Caitlin Clark before and this was the very first game they had ever seen, I think they'd come away saying, that's a really talented player. Maybe they would argue Olivia Miles had the better overall performance. Maybe they'd say Kelsey Mitchell was the best player on the Indiana Fever. Courtney Williams was phenomenal for Minnesota too. That's a completely reasonable opinion. But acting like Caitlin Clark had some terrible performance, I just don't see it. Especially during the first half, she was creating so much offense for Indiana. There were possessions where she broke down defenders off the dribble, got into the mid-range, and knocked down difficult jumpers against quality defenders. Those aren't easy shots. Those are shots only high-level players consistently create for themselves. One thing that stood out to me after rewatching the game was how comfortable she looked attacking different defensive coverages. Minnesota wasn't giving her easy looks. They mixed up their pressure, they tried to make life difficult, and Caitlin Clark still found ways to generate offense for herself and her teammates. Now, did she miss a couple of huge shots late in the fourth quarter? Absolutely. Those misses matter because they're the shots everybody remembers. Basketball fans always remember what happens in the final 2 minutes more than what happened during the previous 38. If Caitlin knocks down even one of those late attempts, I honestly believe the entire discussion around this game changes overnight. Instead of people saying she disappeared, they'd be talking about how she nearly carried Indiana back against one of the toughest teams in the WNBA. That's how quickly narratives change. Another thing that's been bothering me is some of the misinformation that's been spreading online. I saw one viral post claiming Caitlin Clark went 0 for 3 in the clutch with 3 turnovers. That's simply not accurate. She wasn't 0 for 3. She was 0 for 2 during that stretch, and she finished with 1 late turnover after Indiana was already down by multiple possessions while trying to create something out of nothing. That's a completely different story than the one people were trying to push online. Facts matter. If we're going to criticize players, at least criticize them based on what actually happened instead of exaggerating everything because it's Caitlin Clark. Overall, I thought she controlled the game fairly well. She attacked the rim with confidence, made smart reads, and I actually liked her mid-range game. That's becoming a bigger weapon in her arsenal every single month. Now, her three-point shot wasn't falling consistently. She finished 2 for 9 from deep, and obviously that's below her standards. But let's be honest for a second. Every elite shooter has nights like that. Steph Curry has had games where he couldn't buy a 3. Sabrina Ionescu has had off nights. Kelsey Mitchell has had off nights from the perimeter. It happens. Yet whenever Caitlin Clark has one cold shooting night, people immediately start asking whether she can only dominate weaker opponents. We've heard the same talking point over and over again. She only puts up numbers against bad teams. I don't buy that argument because the numbers don't really support it. I've talked about this before. If you compare Caitlin Clark's production against stronger teams versus weaker teams, the difference isn't nearly as dramatic as people pretend. Paige Bueckers has very similar scoring splits depending on the opponent. The gap is incredibly small. Even A'ja Wilson, an MVP caliber player, has fluctuations depending on the matchup, because that's basketball. Not every game is the same, not every defense is the same, not every shooting night is going to look identical. As a matter of fact, while everyone was criticizing Caitlin Clark, Paige Bueckers was having a difficult first half against the Connecticut Sun, one of the weakest teams in the league. Does that suddenly make Paige Bueckers a bad player? Of course not. Nobody says that because everyone understands great players have off stretches. That same understanding should apply to Caitlin Clark. At the end of the day, consistency in this league is incredibly difficult. Every team is preparing specifically to stop the opposing star. Every scouting report is designed to take away your strengths. Some nights you're going to score 30, other nights you'll struggle from 3 but still impact the game in other ways. That's exactly what I think happened here. Caitlin Clark wasn't spectacular, but she was far from bad. She still influenced the offense, created opportunities for teammates, and kept Indiana within striking distance for most of the game. And honestly, that's where the conversation should begin. Not with exaggerated criticism, but with a realistic evaluation of what actually happened on the court. Kelsey Mitchell, on the other hand, deserves a ton of credit because she was outstanding. I've been saying this for a while now, and this game only reinforced my opinion. Kelsey Mitchell is probably the best pure isolation scorer in the WNBA today. Her first step is elite, her speed is incredible, and once she gets a defender one-on-one, she's almost impossible to stay in front of.
That's simply the kind of player she is. But there's also an important difference between Kelsey Mitchell and Caitlin Clark that people often overlook. Defenses don't build their entire game plan around stopping Kelsey Mitchell. Every single night, teams are sending extra pressure at Caitlin Clark. They're picking her up full court, trapping her, blitzing ball screens, and trying to force the ball out of her hands before Indiana's offense can even get organized. That attention creates opportunities for everyone else, including Kelsey Mitchell. That doesn't automatically mean Caitlin Clark is the better player because she draws more defenders, but it absolutely changes how you evaluate what both players are doing. Kelsey Mitchell is a natural scorer. She can disappear for 3 quarters and suddenly explode for 15 or 20 points in the fourth without warning. That's her role, and she's phenomenal at it. Caitlin Clark plays a completely different style of basketball. She's a playmaker first. She's constantly reading the defense, looking for passing angles, manipulating help defenders, and trying to involve every teammate on the floor. Her goal isn't just to score 30 points. Her goal is to control the entire offense. That's why every opponent is so focused on disrupting her rhythm. If Caitlin Clark is comfortable, she's going to score, create open shots for teammates, push the pace, and completely dictate how the game is played. That's exactly why Minnesota made her a priority from the opening tip. I also thought Caitlin slowed down a little during the second half. Statistically, she's still produced points and assists, but the overall influence didn't feel quite as strong as it did early in the game. Credit has to go to the Minnesota Lynx defense because they adjusted and made every possession much more difficult. Even with that, there were encouraging signs. Her handle looked more controlled under pressure, she attacked the mid-range confidently, and despite facing constant full-court pressure, she protected the basketball much better than people are giving her credit for. The late turnover came when Indiana was already trailing and trying to create something quickly. That's completely different from repeatedly making careless mistakes throughout the game. Here's what really frustrates me. If another all-star like Skylar Diggins finished with 19 points, 10 assists, and efficient shooting, the conversation would probably be about how brilliant of a point guard performance it was. People would praise the court vision, decision-making, and leadership. But because it's Caitlin Clark, suddenly those exact same numbers get labeled as disappointing. That's the double standard I'm talking about. Now, was Caitlin Clark great defensively? No, she had some possessions she'd like to have back, and there are still areas where she needs to improve, but she also wasn't the biggest defensive problem for Indiana in this game. Basketball is a team sport, and wins and losses almost always come down to more than one player. People have also brought up the idea that Caitlin Clark might not have been feeling 100% physically. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. She's played through migraines before and still delivered huge performances, so I'm not going to use that as an excuse. Every player deals with bumps, bruises, and difficult nights over the course of a season. Looking at the bigger picture, though, Indiana should still feel optimistic. They were competitive against arguably the best team in the league, and Caitlin Clark produced what many players would consider an outstanding stat line, despite not playing her absolute best. If 19 points and 10 assists are considered a disappointing game by her standards, that tells you just how high the expectations have become. The Indiana Fever are still one of the most dangerous offensive teams in the WNBA. If they continue improving defensively, clean up the rebounding, and help Caitlin Clark find her rhythm earlier in games, they'll be a legitimate threat against anybody. This loss doesn't change that. It simply shows there's still another level this team can reach, and that's what makes the rest of the season so exciting.
So they asked Caitlin Clark this question in their press conference. Why? What relevance is this to basketball? What relevance is this to Caitlin Clark?
I think for us, it's not really a discussion we really have in our locker room. I think it's for leagues and the governing bodies to work with their athletes to find solutions, but our focus is on basketball, and that's what we talk about and how we can get wins, and obviously we didn't do that tonight, so we need to find an area to improve in that way.
Do you have any, reaction to the...
I just answered for you.
All right. We'll go over to the Zoom. We'll start with Chloe.
Caitlin Clark's performance on the court. But somehow it has become one of the biggest stories surrounding the Indiana Fever. Honestly, I don't understand what some members of the media are trying to accomplish. At this point, it feels like they're not looking for information anymore. They're looking for a viral headline. They're trying to corner Caitlin Clark with questions that have no good answer. Seriously, what is she supposed to say? No matter which direction she goes, somebody is going to be angry. There is literally no response Caitlin Clark can give that doesn't create another controversy. That's why I think this entire situation is unfair. Whether she agrees with one side, disagrees with the other, or refuses to answer, people are going to twist her words into whatever narrative they already want to believe. The reality is that Caitlin Clark doesn't make league policy. Sophie Cunningham doesn't make league policy. Cheryl Reeve doesn't make league policy. The governing bodies of the sport are the ones making those decisions. Whether Caitlin Clark supports them or not isn't going to change the final outcome. That's simply how professional sports work. If Sophie Cunningham wants to publicly discuss a particular issue, that's her decision. She has every right to express her opinion. But Caitlin Clark has also made it clear that she doesn't want to become the face of every off-court debate. She wants to focus on basketball. And honestly, that should be respected. You could even see the reaction from Kelsey Mitchell whenever those questions came up. It was almost like everyone in the room already knew exactly where the conversation was heading. And that's the frustrating part. Every single press conference turns into the exact same cycle. Instead of talking about the game, strategy, player development, or what actually happened on the court, reporters keep asking the same loaded questions over and over again. It doesn't matter whether they're from Outkick or from media outlets on the opposite end of the spectrum. Both sides are chasing a headline, and Caitlin Clark becomes the center of the storm. I actually think Caitlin Clark handled it about as well as anyone could. Her response was simple. She basically said she'll follow whatever the league decides, because those decisions aren't hers to make. That's probably the safest and smartest answer available. You can tell she expected the question and had already thought through how she wanted to respond, because she understood there was no perfect answer. Meanwhile, people online continue trying to turn everything into a massive controversy. We saw reactions surrounding the Seattle Storm game, protests outside the arena, fans arguing with one another, and even incidents involving spectators that had nothing to do with the players themselves. Somehow, every one of those stories gets tied back to Caitlin Clark, even when she's simply trying to prepare for the next basketball game. Personally, I don't think this becomes a distraction inside the Indiana Fever locker room. These players don't spend every waking hour scrolling through social media. They hear the question during media availability, answer it as professionally as they can, and then they move on. When you watch the team interact, you don't see a divided locker room. You see teammates supporting each other, joking around, and preparing for the next opponent. Even if players disagree with Sophie Cunningham's opinions, that doesn't automatically mean relationships inside the locker room fall apart. Professional athletes work with teammates who have different opinions all the time. That's part of sports. Disagreement doesn't automatically equal hatred. At the end of the day, I think both extremes are trying to turn Caitlin Clark into something she doesn't want to be. One side wants her to become a political spokesperson. The other side wants her to publicly fight every cultural battle. But everything we've seen from Caitlin Clark suggests she has one priority: playing basketball and helping the Indiana Fever win games. That's always been her focus. Beat whoever is standing in front of you, make the right basketball play, help your teammates, compete every single night. Because of that, I honestly believe she gave the best answer possible. Would everyone be satisfied? Absolutely not. People were going to criticize her regardless of what she said, but by keeping the focus on the league instead of herself, she probably minimized the backlash as much as anyone realistically could. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think Caitlin Clark handled the situation the right way, or do you think there was a better response she could have given? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel for more WNBA coverage.